Hello, everyone.
Hello.
There is NLP Radio on stream. And again, we are having in our studio me, Olga Sarkisova, I am a linguist and a philologist, and Alexandr Gerasimov. Hello, Alexander.
Hello, Olga.
Alexander is, I'm introducing to you again, a famous NLP trainer in Russia, NLP practitioner, NLP master, a famous negotiator. Geography of seminars and trainings led by Alexander is 22 countries and 70 cities. So I have introduced you a wonderful guest today. We have learned a lot by American books by Richard Bandler and Grinder, and we have prepared something for you right now. We've got something to share with you. The topic we're discussing today is going to be anchoring. How to set anchors. But first of all, I need to ask Alexander, what are anchors? What are these?
Basically, anchors are anchoring is a process of building. An anchor is a stimulus, a trigger that causes a certain reaction in a person, while anchoring is a process of building a certain link between such a trigger and response. For example, seeing some brand's logo or a person's face makes us experience certain emotions. Or when we hear some song, some memories associated with that song arise. I think everyone has his own or her own select playlist containing soundtracks that can make them feel better or worse.
Right. What came to my mind when you said is a perfume. For instance, for a girl, it could be a perfume smell of your first man in her life. So when you hear this perfume, you immediately remember everything you had in your life. I believe it's a strong anchor, isn't it? It's an anchor as well.
Yes, multiple factors, smell, anchors are some of the strongest ones. They correspond to specific cortical activity. So those anchors are some of the most powerful anchors. There are not only visual anchors. When we see something, not only auditory anchors. When we hear something, but also touching-related anchors, or taste-related ones. For example, some memories associated with a certain taste. That very taste, that verity. It was an advertising slogan in Russia a long time ago. There are already mentioned multiple factor smell anchors, and those can be combined. For example, by appearance. We immediately start feeling some smells. For example, when we see some product, we begin to remember the very smell, or even the very sound we felt on or heard when we were anchoring.
A very powerful thing. Looks like it has a very strong power on us. And I think one of the tools, one of the instruments is setting an anchor. Setting an anchor, creating an anchor. So the question is actually, what for should we set an anchor to ourselves or to others?
As for ourselves, we can set anchors to cause a certain state. For example, a certain working spirit before starting doing something, or maybe to energize yourself when you have to do some boring, monotonous work, which you would like to do faster. You launch a playlist which makes you experience energy-related emotions. It could be some rock or hard rock soundtracks, or punk rock, for example, and things will go much better.
How about Hachaturian music, classical music of fighting with swords?
Everyone may have a specific anchor to a certain soundtrack. In order to use an anchor, you have to previously set it on yourself. The same with other people. We can make a person experience pleasant emotions, emotions related to consent, to anchor them and to retrigger them during negotiations. Or, on the contrary, to make someone experience a negative attitude or disgust, and to retrigger it when a certain person starts talking about a competitor or proposing something we didn't want or dislike, and so on. In this situation, anchors will be determined by... anchors are tools. The question is what specific emotion we'd like to retrigger in ourselves or in other people, and then use it.
Right. Right. Up to now, it's interesting a lot, but it's not clear to me. How is it possible to do it? Do we do it physically? Do we do it verbally? Do we hypnotize? What is the method of setting an anchor? How to set an anchor?
It depends on what kind of anchor you use. If it is a visual anchor, a gesture would probably be enough. Or your facial expression during communication. It could be a drawing or a symbol. Those are visual anchors. For example, if you compile a list of your personal visual anchors, it may contain a combination of colors, your homeland's national flag that you see while being abroad, for example, or some color, a specific color, deep blue or, for example, rich red, which could retrigger a certain state. Those are visual anchors. Auditory anchors. Apart from a melody, everyone can specify a soundtrack which is associated either with her or his first date, or with a tragic situation. It may be associated with some walks or meditation. The simplest auditory anchor is a phone call. When you hear a phone ring, your arm automatically moves to pick up. I remember I had the Doors' "People Are Strange" ringtone on one of my previous phones, and even nowadays when I hear the soundtrack, I immediately recall the phone model. Or during another period of my life, I had the alarm soundtrack from Groundhog Day as my alarm sound. The lead character used to wake up hearing that alarm soundtrack. So did I for some time, and now when I hear that soundtrack, I immediately recall my sensations of waking up and turning off the alarm. Those are auditory anchors. You can set an anchor through touching. It is more difficult to set during negotiations, but for example, we can set such an anchor on ourselves by touching our earlobes, wrists, quadriceps muscles, for example, and to pin a state you would like to save.
Okay, but I believe it should be something we don't do every day, something non-standard, not habitual, something more extraordinary. For instance, we touch ourselves' ears like all the time. Can it be the anchor as well?
Yes, there are 3 prerequisites you should meet in order to set an anchor. The first prerequisite should be a peak state. We should set an anchor when we are in a peak state, when we experience a certain emotion very much. It often happens that we experience a cocktail of emotions simultaneously. Even now, if you analyze your state, you may find out that apart from enjoying listening to useful and interesting information, you also have impressions of some previous conversation, some concern about an unresolved problem or anticipation of an upcoming meeting. It is a mix, a combination of some emotions, and there is no some dominant in its pure form. Therefore, it is recommended that you should set an anchor exactly, being in a peak state. How can you understand that it is a peak state? It may be peak in expression of an emotion, for example, too loudly, or a gesture of the highest amplitude. During communication, you should pay attention to the level a person's involvement into a process. When you notice that a person seems to be in a peak state and set an anchor on him or her, and realize in a minute or two that that person gets to a higher state, you should set an additional anchor, to set an anchor once again. As a result, you will reinforce the first anchor. When you are learning, there is not much of a problem in setting an anchor improperly, or something like that. This is prerequisite number 1, in peak state. The second one, it should be a unique anchor. It is exactly what you, Olga, were talking about. Your anchor should differ from any other anchors or accidental touching or accidental melodies. For example, if you set a handshaking anchor in a man, he will be shaking hands with other men in an office. and that anchor will disappear. So if it is a handshaking, it should be a specific handshaking, accompanied by a slap on a shoulder or, for example, a stronger handshaking, something like this.
More intensive.
Yes, more intensive.
Okay.
The third required prerequisite for setting an anchor apart from the peak state and uniqueness, it should be an easily repeatable, reproducible anchor. Because if, for example, you set a shoulder touch anchor on a person during your first contact, causing his friendly state, it may happen that you won't be able to touch that person to re-trigger the state during talks. So it is recommended that you set an anchor within your physical reach. I suggest that you should set rather a visual anchor, because it may be a gesture, it may be a facial reaction such as an eye wink, for example, or displaying an exaggerated emotional expression, exactly to be able to rather easily reproduce a visual anchor.
I see. So I believe that one more condition is important one to reach a peak of state, to be able to make it unique and easily produced. It should definitely be fast. It should be something produced quickly. The anchor, I believe, setting it must be something very quickly, right? Like in 1 second.
We can set only a visual anchor quickly. It is the fastest one. There is some logic in it. At first, we see a person at some distance. And at this phase, we also can start communicating if that person sees us too. Then we can hear when the distance gets shorter. And then we can experience some feelings toward that person. It will be okay if you start setting a visual anchor to additionally set an auditory anchor when you get to a closer communication.
Okay, so we can add them one to another. That's an interesting point.
Or, for example, you begin to communicate with a person you know, and so-called small talk, when you can talk about nothing. A small talk may be a good way to make a person experience certain emotions by asking that person what he or she was doing on weekend. Tell him or her a story that happened to you or some news stories. And when you notice that that person's state is changing, you add some gesture to set an anchor.
Right. So the question which comes out of what you're saying is that probably not only a resourceful state could be anchored, but also probably non-resourceful, negative, depressive, dull states. What kind of states can be anchored?
For the first communication, the first level communication, when you have just begun to communicate with a person, having 2 or 3 anchors would be enough. For example, it is a resource, a consent anchor when a person agrees with you and is loyal towards you. And second, a negative state, denial, a protest, or disgust. These are your accelerator and brake pedals in communication with that person. As soon as that person starts talking about what you dislike, you reproduce a non-resource anchor. When you start offering your conditions to that person, you use a resource anchor, so that person will state in his mind of, I feel good when he is talking, and I feel bad when we are arguing. When we are arguing about or discussing price, for example, during business talks, it is a simple example. We also anchor a state decisiveness in a person. Admit it is important in terms of decision-making during negotiations. When your opponent doesn't think for too long but agrees with you and wants to do something, it may be a state of sadness, deceleration of a state. When a person is in a hurry and you understand that you'd better stall for a time and use this anchor during talks, The number of anchors could be equal to the number of emotions. I wouldn't talk about resource or non-resource emotions or states. There are appropriate and inappropriate states. In some situations, it is very appropriate to be angry and fierce or wrathful. In other situations, it is inappropriate to be joyful, and you can use anchoring as a process rather as guides navigating your communications to a certain direction.
Okay. What I'd like to say is before our podcast, before our meeting today, I was listening a lot of American materials on anchoring. And you know what? They are very different, totally different in their description comparing to what you say. Because an American interpretation of NLP trainers, when you ask them what is anchoring, they will tell you that it is like a bookmark which gets you back to a place which was relevant or beneficial to you. So like a bookmark which you put somewhere in order to get back to it when you need. And they talk only about positive states, only about beneficial states. They say nothing of non-resourceful or negative states. Well, that's interesting, really.
Well, I can give you an example. For instance, you feel that you are too excitable and reckless and too active in a certain situation. When calmness or some sort of deceleration is needed, you have a calmness and deceleration anchor. Admit it could be reasonable to add soar seriousness to a certain situation. Yes, we can say it to reproduce a bookmark for the state of calmness.
Okay. I think much more interesting for our audience, for our listeners, would be not only how to anchor others, maybe a boyfriend, a boss, whoever else, but how to anchor our own selves. I think it gives a lot of resources to us, ability to anchor ourselves. Could you maybe bring up a few examples, deduce a few examples, how we can anchor our own self for something important?
For example, you have to deliver a speech in front of a group of people. It may be a meeting or presentation, and the person is anxious. For example, a situation that once happened to me when I was unexpectedly asked to deliver a speech in front of 400 people in a huge hall. It was a rather unusual experience. I had never delivered a speech in front of such audience and in that format. And I remember very well how reproduced. I would call it some kind of zero state anchor, a state of nothing, when I didn't feel joy, self-confidence, calmness, excitement, nothing, just a state of emptiness, but not desolation, but everything is bad, but some neutrality. Using this anchor, I'm touching my face with both hands and rub it. I achieve some zero state in this moment, some kind of purification. I remember a situation when I reproduced that anchor several times intentionally prior to entering a stage. It was an assembly hall at a cultural center. It was a security conference. There were lots of military and special service officers in the hall, and I was on the stage, telling them about Rapper and other NLP tools. I decided that that state would be the most appropriate delivering a speech in front of that audience. Not joy, not excitement, not anything else like that, but a state of, I'd call it, metaphorical indifference. I considered that state to be the most appropriate, reproduced it several times, achieved it, and then began to talk.
So one of the states Alexander has mentioned is zeroing out. So when you can zero yourself out. That's something I have never heard of, right? Okay. I have heard about such a thing as anchor collapsing. Anchor collapsing. Is it a technique? Is it a tool? Is it something we do but don't realize we do so? What is it?
We can surely find ourselves in a situation when we are influenced by an anchor. For example, a certain soundtrack is causing a state that we wouldn't like to experience in that situation. It may be, for example, memories about a person. For example, you hear some music and immediately remember your ex. You didn't want to experience that state. In order to remove that anchor, you can use collapsing anchors technique.
Okay.
This technique consists of just several steps, and you can easily apply it even using this description. First, you should realize what state you are experiencing when you hear that melody or song. Let it be a state of dissatisfaction, anger, irritation, or something like that. As soon as you realize your state, ask yourself a question: what would be opposite to that state to you? In this case, it will be your personal setting. For example, some person considers calmness to be opposite to irritation, while another person may have nothing opposite to irritation, the lack of any state. A third person may consider joyfulness to be opposite to irritation. So ask yourself a question: what state would be opposite to that state you are currently experiencing? This is the second step, number 2. The third step is, I suggest that you should set an anchor related to that third, opposite state. For example, some music makes you feel some irritation. You know that opposite to this state is active joyfulness. You achieve this state of active joyfulness and then set an anchor. For example, touching a leg. Then you reproduce both anchors simultaneously. The next step. You launch that soundtrack and reproduce the opposite anchor. For a greater effect of this technique, I suggest that you should make that opposite anchor much stronger than the first anchor. You will find out that minus and plus can give you a zero state or conditional resource. Next time you'll be surprised when hearing that music. You not only won't remember anything, you'll just experience a state of not understanding, confusing, emptiness, or something else. You should be prepared to experience that state when reproducing that anchor. Maybe you'd better complete this technique with your eyes closed to better feel these sensations.
Yeah, I've got 2 questions. While you were talking, you said you take one state, for example, irritation, negative state. Then you take another state, which is the opposite to the first, to irritation. For instance, it's joy, the feeling of joy. Then the next step, you said try to enter joy. So I've got a question: how to do it? How to enter the state of joy?
For this purpose, I recommend that you should remove all distracting factors and remember the state or situation, any state or situation when you experienced a certain emotion. It may be light, when you experienced it just a little bit. In this case, in order to improve your experience level, you should boost that state by determining, for example, joy inside of you is some motion. Make this motion more intensively to boost that state.
Okay.
It may be, for example, some memories of yours about that state. And when you start describing what you were seeing at that moment, what you were hearing at that moment, that state will gradually concentrate and you will begin to experience this joyfulness at a higher level, and you can anchor it at that moment.
Okay, so in order to enter the state of joy, you should take it from your memories, right? You should take it from your memories, what you felt, what you heard, and all the others. And this will be the way to enter joy. And then after, we should put simultaneously 2 anchors on both. Okay. What if we fail? What if we can't make this technique anchor collapsing from the first time? Is it possible not to be able to do it from the first time? How many times should we repeat to succeed?
By my reckoning, the key thing in this situation is understanding of how this technique works. When you have this understanding, you will be able to use this technique pretty easily. Sometimes we do collapsing anchors ourselves without knowing about it. For example, in some situation when a joyful melody begins to sound and we see an unpleasant person, we become completely at a loss at this moment. It is actually this technique. Or, for example, when we hear some speech paradoxes, because it is also some sort of paradoxical thinking when we hear someone saying, "Hurry up slowly," or the proverb, "Slow and steady wins the race." If you try to comprehend it using logic, you will fall into a collapse-like state, a paradoxical state, as you cannot move slowly and arrive rapidly. So while a person is in that confusion, lost state, collapse, which raises both polarities occurs, a person finds himself or herself being amid of nowhere, a trance-like state.
Right. Okay, so now hearing to what Alexander says, I more and more understand that reading NLP books, listening to our NLP podcasts is nothing until you experience it. All those techniques, all those tools, they only get alive when you start experiencing them, living them through. So thank you, Alexander, very much for this podcast. It was, again, a lot of causing to think. Thank you a lot, dear listeners. If you like that information, if it came up helpful for you, appeared helpful, you're very welcome with your likes and reposts. And we hear each other in a week, next time.
Yes, I'd like to thank all listeners of this podcast. Please, leave a comment and describe anchors that you have found in yourself in commands: visual, auditory, kinesthetic, olfactory, and gustatory. It can be a brand logo or a song. It can be a fragrance or something very taste in your memories. Describe anchors that you have found on yourself after listening to this podcast.
Yeah, please write in English. We may discuss it in commentaries. Bye.